Many of you are familiar with the experience of sitting in a public place and speaking with a friend or a colleague in a language that you believe no one else understands. You speak in a normal voice, yet your words are a secret to everyone else. Your conversation is part of the sounds of the place, but at the same time, it is a separate linguistic unit, voiced yet not comprehended. You have the freedom to speak about other people around you or to express views that you might not express otherwise. You can also bring in pieces of information, ways of thinking from what you hear around you, assuming that your conversation partner will be familiar with them. Yet none of your phrases can be overheard and understood or quoted by others. You are part of a private and isolated conversation in a public place. To some extent, Professor Weisman and I see Hebrew literature and now also Hebrew scholarship as representing this kind of a secret conversation. They are a speech that is not hidden in any way. It is not whispered, and it often takes place in a global setting. International conferences, the MLA. We even had several conferences on Hebrew literature here at Stanford. Hebrew books, as you know, are translated and read in many places around the world. But all in all, the conversation in the field can still be largely defined by the fact that a relatively small community shares it. Here is one example of this kind of conversation that I recently encountered while writing a paper on Hebrew poetry. Paraphrasing James Joyce's Here Comes Everybody, the Hebrew poet Yehuda Amichai wrote, "I sang with everybody because I everybodied. I everybodied a lot with everybody. שרתי עם כולם כי כולמתי, כולמתי מאוד עם כולם." Reading this verse in Amichai, having you as audience in mind, and translating it to English, I became much more attuned to some of the meanings of these two lines. There is an untranslatable play here with the similarities in sound between klum, nothing, and kulam, everybody. Amichai is creating the verb everybodied, which combines the two meanings. The translation to English emphasizes the meaning of becoming everybody, but misses the fact that in the Hebrew original, the same word connotes that the process of becoming everybody leaves you empty. Moreover, in an ingenious way, Amichai tells us two opposite things with the same words. His speaker says that he became everybody, but he does so in a creative and unique way, telling us through the choice of language, not just here comes everybody, but here I come with my individual talent, inserting into the language and culture of the community my own inventive speech. In the context of the private Hebrew conversation, that of Amichai's poem to the Hebrew reader, and that which takes place among the critics of Hebrew literature, it is not this kind of lyrical subjectivity as a certain point of balance or imbalance between individual and universal that would most likely be discussed. Around the Hebrew scholars' table, the more common and pressing question would probably be breaking the balance between the private I, or the private subject, and the national I. In this context, we or us, in Hebrew kulam, kulanu, would very likely be understood not as everybody, but as all of us, all of the people that speak Hebrew and read Hebrew literature, or are in one way or another part of the same national, ethnic, or religious community. And so, as Amichai writes in this poem, he remembers falling from a bike in his childhood in a foreign land and growing up, most likely in Israel, where he grew up, where he sang with everyone, "If we were thrown down, we were not startled." A very nationalistic song that ends with the words, "The people of Israel are alive, Am Yisrael Chai." The song was written in response to the sinking of a ship with about 800 Jewish refugees on 1941. Becoming everybody then, through singing this specific song, means becoming part of the chorus, the national chorus. But the courage that comes from this kind of togetherness disappears the moment the speaker travels back to the foreign land. He finds himself alone and useless, with a suitcase full of things and words, dvarim, that he cannot share. In our period of so much connectivity and of rapid globalization, one would expect to find more interactions between different geographical and cultural centers. After all, we are in the era in which when we Google, "Here comes everybody," one of the first results we would get is Clay Shirky's famous book by this name, On the Way Technology Changes Our Society. "Here comes everybody" in this context assumes more democratic and inclusive discourse. But are we really moving away from us to everyone? Or are we just becoming more aware of the fact that, as Amichai's poem demonstrates, texts are always written to a certain collective, to a public, and there is no group that can be defined as everybody? This new connectivity allows us to create new salons, new global public spaces, and provides us with more opportunities for conversations between different communities. Yet, Professor Anat Weisman and me argue that despite this welcome change, the discourse in Israel and among Hebrew scholars continues to be isolated, and at times it feels that it is even more isolated than it used to be. The field, so to speak, still finds itself alone with a suitcase of ideas that could be shared and exchanged, but in practice are not. It is this realization that made Professor Weisman and me feel that there is a need in joining the online public space in a new way. We decided to establish a journal that will not stand alone, but will be located at Arcade, one of the leading and bustling open academic publishing spaces for the discussion of literature and culture. We are not looking for a way to find common denominators between Hebrew and other literatures and culture, and also not for anecdotes or special moments that would be interesting for everyone. What we would like to create instead is a space that will allow us to continuously stay engaged and open to translating again and again our conversations to the point that they are not just heard but also understood. The need in more inclusive conversation is, of course, not specific to Hebrew or Yiddish, but maybe it could serve as a model for more discussions across different private tables. As you know, for our first issue, Professor Weisman, Professor Eshel, and I decided to focus on spoken word, written word, rethinking the representation of speech in literature. As some of you know, Dibur, the name of our new journal, means in Hebrew speech. The more colloquial meaning is conversation, understanding, as in Yesh li dibur itchem. So focusing on representations of speech seems like a good place to begin the discussion. Our goal in this first issue is to revisit the complex affinities between literature and speech as they manifest themselves in stylistic, ethical, and ideological contexts. We thank Professor Roland Green, which unfortunately was unable to join us today, he's away, and the board of Arcade for including us as one of Arcade's publications. We also thank our supporters, the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, the Humanities Dean, the Israeli Institute, and the Division for Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, and Gabriela, who's the head of the division, is here, for their generous support. Dr. Gidon Tikotsky, our visiting scholar and executive director of Dibur, took time from writing another book to help coordinate the conference. We would not have been able to do it without him. Oh, thank you, Gidon.
At the end, only at the end, if it does succeed.
At the end, again, and again, yeah. Okay, so we are grateful beyond words to Professor Amir Eshel, the head of comparative literature here at Stanford, and to Steve Zipperstein, one of our leading Jewish historians, for agreeing to be our consultants and for their warm, kind, and brilliant advising. Thank you. And finally, a huge thank you to our board and to each and every one of you. All of you are well-known scholars. You can publish anywhere. We don't take it for granted, and it is a great honor for us that you agreed to be part of our first issue. So thank you, and I hope you will find the meetings worthwhile and thought-provoking. And now, let's turn to the highlight of the evening, a lecture by the legendary Marjorie Perloff, and a reading by the gifted Israeli poet and scholar Zali Gurevitch. We could not think of a better scholar to start this conversation than Professor Marjorie Perloff, one of the leading experts and thinkers on both the modern and the contemporary. She is a true scholar of our time. Her thinking always includes the now and here. She has an amazing ability, amazing talent to find the new in canonical works like Yeats and Stevens that were studied by so many before her, and to bring into the canon the most experimental, innovative works that might have been seen as obscure or too new to some of us without her comments. So she wrote extensively on issues related to the representation of speech and poetic language. Here are some of her books. It's impossible to get everything into one page. She published numerous books, articles, and essays on issues ranging from digital poetics to the connection between poetry and art and poetry and philosophy. Her work has been translated into many languages, including Portuguese, Spanish, German, and French. Professor Perloff is not a guest here at Stanford, as many of you know. She is part of this place. She joined Stanford at 1986, and from 1991 held the Sadi Durham Patek Chair. Since 2001, she is an emerita here. Her other current academic affiliation is with the University of Southern California, where she is a scholar in residence and the Florence Scott Professor of English Emerita. I met Professor Perloff 23 years ago. I was a student of Professor Hannah Kronfeld, who's also here with us. And Professor Perloff agreed to let me attend her classes. I sat right next to Michael Goldstone, who's here. Where's Michael? Yeah. So, and is going to be one of the guest editors of the fourth issue. Yeah. Introducing her tonight is a huge honor and a personal pleasure. So please help me welcome Professor Marjorie Perloff.
I'm very happy to be here, although I feel a little, here comes everybody. I don't know a word of Hebrew. My native language is German, and I do have a new book which actually is apropos for many of you, which is more about fiction, though, than about poetry, about it's going to be called Austro-Modernism, writing at the edge of empire, edge both geographic and edge historic, and it's on Krauss, Karl Krauss, Roth, Joseph Roth, Musil, Kennedy, and one poet, Paul Celan. It ends with Paul Celan as the kind of last Habsburg poet. But anyway, so it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, what I'm talking about today, though. I was asked to talk about conceptual poetry, and so I'm just going to talk about the development of that. And I say I don't know comparable Hebrew things, although I have a lot of Israeli friends who send me poetry, but I don't know how much of this work has caught on. There is one person, though, and that's Paley Gritzer. I don't know whether any of you know Paley. Do you? He was at the University of Tel Aviv. He's now at Harvard. And I read him on Facebook all the time, and he works on all this experimental poetry. And there are a few other people, too, but Paley Gritzer is one, and there's one in New York, whose name I'll think of in a minute. Okay. Now, the topic is supposed to be representational speech and conceptual poetry. The term conceptual poetry is, of course, something of a misnomer. In the art world, conceptualism usually said to have been born in the 60s, but in fact going back to at least as far as Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades of 1915 and set to 17 is by no means contested. On the contrary, it has remained the dominant art concept of the past half-century. Such later 20th century movements as Fluxus, minimalism, earth art, performance, installation, light art are all conceptualist in their subordination of the material object to a set of generating ideas. Broadly speaking, conceptual art plays down the visual dimension of painting or sculpture in favor of an overriding concept and the use of verbal text, the placement of a few words or sentences on a canvas or page, as in the work of John Baldessari or Lawrence Weiner, Sherry Levine. I mean, you all know a lot of these artists, Robert Smithson, conceptual artists. Now, logically speaking, if a conceptual painting is one that defies expectations by subordinating what Duchamp called the retinal shudder to language, then a conceptual poem should be one that substitutes visual text for verbal composition. But it doesn't work that way. How can there be a poem without words? Not surprisingly, then, critics have been very skeptical of the very idea of conceptual writing. Indeed, the term continues to cause outrage in poetry circles. In 2005, when Kenneth Goldsmith published a manifesto piece called Paragraphs on Conceptual Writing, which was in fact simply a recycling of Sol LeWitt's now classic 1967 essay, Paragraphs on Conceptual Art, substituting the word author every time the word artist was there, he put in the word author. And the next thing that happened is that the poetry community, being totally unaware of the work's origins, that's how much we have Here Comes Everybody, started raising all kinds of objections to the conceptualist thesis, thus proving Goldsmith's point that what had been acceptable in the art world ever since 1967, when Sol LeWitt had those famous theses, and they were an art forum, and I mean, very well known, in the art world, could still cause consternation among poets 40 years or more later. Poetry, by this argument, is way behind the art world, but we can argue that later. But how does the term anyway transfer from the visual to the verbal arts? In The Fate of Echo, his introduction to Against Expressionism, the anthology of conceptual writing he edited with Kenneth Goldsmith, Craig Dworkin, who's one of the best people who's written on all this, addresses this very issue. As in the case of the visual arts, he suggests, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. But since writing cannot by definition do without language, conceptualist poetry refers not to the substitution of image for the expected word, but for the unique link between conception and the text itself. The basic material remains the written word, but it is now subordinated, as in conceptual art, to an overriding concept with which the poet begins. The word, moreover, is often appropriate. The work is, moreover, appropriated usually from an external source. So actually most so-called conceptual writing is all what I've talked about in my book, Unoriginal Genius. It's all citational. It's all found text. It's all taken from other sources. This has gone much too far actually in the last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about some works I think don't work at the end. But anyway, idea and appropriation do go hand in hand, for in conceptual poetics, and this is the point I really want to make, choice and framing are central to whatever imaginative transformation takes place. As Duchamp put it in his anonymous editorial for The Blind Man, the magazine The Blind Man, back in 1917, defending his submission of a urinal-labeled fountain to the Salon of the Independents, and he wrote anonymously, but everybody knew it was that he was really R. Mutt. Whether Mr. Mutt made his fountains with his own hands has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared. Under the new title and point of view, he created a new thought for that object. Now, how does the representation of speech work in the conceptual context? I'm going to talk about a recent book by Kenneth Goldsmith called 7 American Deaths and Disasters, 2013, that, like many of Goldsmith's works, use actual speech, since we're talking about speech here, uses actual speech taken from radio broadcasts. And therefore people say, oh, it's nothing, that's not a work of art, it's just other people's speech. A recorded speech, and the episode I'm going to talk about is the one on the World Trade Center on 9/11. Which reproduces a set of TV and radio broadcasts that covered 9/11. But before we get to that, I want to look at what it came out of, earlier work. 2 works, one of the 60s by Frank O'Hara and one of the 80s by Charles Bernstein, and show you how that evolution works. So I'm going to begin in the 60s with, and I wrote a book on Frank O'Hara, with a poem in Frank O'Hara's Lunch Poems. This is a book City Lights just republished because it's its anniversary. It came out in '64. And I wrote about it for Poetry Magazine. I think is a kind of classic, this book. But it now looks like a very different aesthetic than what I'm going to be talking about. In the '60s, and I think of this as the era, for those of you who don't work on American material, of Ginsberg, Allen Ginsberg, Charles Olson, Robert Creeley. Authenticity was the big word, and the idea was to somehow give the sense of authentic speech, speaking the way somebody really speaks. And Frank O'Hara wrote a manifesto where he said, I could just as well be talking on the telephone. It's before cell phones, of course. I could just as well be talking on the telephone to a friend. But I decided, to write it as a poem, and he wrote them very quickly. So the one we're going to look at in Mind Your Way is Lana Turner Has Collapsed. Poem Lana Turner Has Collapsed. Short. Lana Turner has collapsed. I was trotting along, and suddenly it started raining and snowing, and you said it was hailing, but hailing hits you on the head hard, so it was really snowing and raining, and I was in such a hurry to meet you. But the traffic was acting exactly like the sky, and suddenly I see a headline, Lana Turner has collapsed. There is no snow in Hollywood. There's no rain in California. I have been to lots of parties and acted perfectly disgraceful, but I never actually collapsed. Oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. Now, that poem first became notorious. 1962 is the date, because of the circumstances of its composition. At Wagner College on Staten Island, where O'Hara gave a joint reading with Robert Lowell, then the kind of, not the poet laureate, but an elegant establishment figure, O'Hara began by informing the audience that he had written Lana Turner on the Staten Island ferry coming over from Manhattan. And Robert Lowell didn't like that at all, and he said, well, I don't read poems that I wrote on the ferry coming over. I'm going to, serious Red Skunk Hour or something like that. But in fact, even O'Hara's seeming spontaneity is carefully orchestrated. By 1962, when O'Hara wrote his little lyric, Lana Turner, the glamorous sweater girl of the 1940s, and femme fatale of such film noir as The Postman Always Rings Twice, was a has-been. Her career had been badly damaged, I don't know how many of you know this, you don't really need to, by her affair with mobster Johnny Stompanato, who was killed in 1958 when Lana's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crawford, caught the two fighting and killed Stompanato with a knife. And that was a major item in the newspapers, of course, because it was so dramatic and so terrible, and lots has been written about that. It was like a scene from a B movie. Now, Lana Turner has collapsed. The tabloid headline, real or invented, and I suspect the headline didn't actually say that, probably said something slightly different, is thus wonderfully absurd, collapsed being a curiously empty verb. One can, after all, collapse from exhaustion or of a heat stroke as easily as from a heart attack. This silly announcement becomes the occasion for the poet's account of his stressful morning, an account made surprisingly immediate by its address to a nameless you. As far as speech is concerned, he's talking to a friend, evidently, and they're running around in Manhattan, and he's talking to you. Of course, behind the you is the reader, really. But the word choice is very interesting, trotting. I was trotting along. Animals trot, people don't, making the poet look silly as he confronts the rain and snow. And you said it was hailing, but it couldn't be hailing because hailing hits you on the head. So it's you said and I said. So it's meant to be very authentic, actual speech, dramatic, and all that. The line break and alliteration of H's give the account an off-tune note. Rain and snow are bad enough, snarling the traffic. And Frank always seems to be late for a lunch date. But, so, and, paratactic structure. We can see the eye getting more and more exasperated when, lo and behold, as they're talking about the hail and the snow, he sees that headline. It acts like a tonic, making the bad weather suddenly palatable. After all, there's no snow in Hollywood, there's no rain in California, at least not in the poster version. The logic of these statements is wholly absurd, suggesting as they do that if Lana Turner has collapsed even in sunny California, the poet trotting around in the hail and snow is somehow above the fray. I've been to lots of parties and acted perfectly disgraceful. Who's he saying that to? He's saying that, I guess, to his friend, but by that time, the friend never really seems to quite be there, and he's really saying it to the reader or to himself. I've been to lots of parties, very colloquial, and acted perfectly disgraceful, but I never actually collapsed. Maybe things aren't so bad after all. And then you get that wonderful, campy last line, oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. Now, nothing about this 17-line poem with its breathless, run-on lines capturing the tempo of Midtown Manhattan is dated, although the aesthetic we have today certainly isn't like this aesthetic anymore. Lana Turner remains a potent Hollywood legend. Witness Calvin Bedient's literary magazine by that name. There's a magazine called Lana Turner now. And the moment of everyday life represented, the way an unexpected external stimulus can suddenly break a mood, is made so real we can see and feel it. The feat of such writing, and it was very hard to do and has been much imitated, is not to say too much. Information is kept to a minimum. Think how the poem would be spoiled by the details of the Stompanato story. You could have had it all in here. Think about that. And generalization is avoided. We overhear the poet speaking to himself in natural speech rhythms. It isn't really natural. A lesser poet would tell us or tell the addressee what he or she has learned from contemplating the headline, or would pontificate about the hollowness of Hollywood glamour. There's no moralizing here. There is not too much. That's part of the trick of that particular aesthetic. It was very much the trick. Why is he so upset? Perhaps someone insulted him. Perhaps he was involved in a lover's quarrel. Who knows? O'Hara knows better than to dwell on such disclosures. His aim is to portray a situation where anyone, he was gay, anyone straight or gay, could identify with. And so he gives us that final campy gesture. Oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. The addressee of these lines is, of course, not Lana Turner, but the reader, won over by Frank's charm and good humor, and ready to laugh with him. How terrible life is, but how funny. And let's all remember, we do get up again. You know, there's that sense, well, we can get up. Now, Frank O'Hara's poetry achieves this calculated spontaneity, and I would call it calculated because, of course, he isn't really recording actual speech, but it's very formed, by its delicate adjustments of tone, the relationship of speaker to addressee to which we as readers are privy and complicit. It was a great feat, and John Ashbery's poetry creates similar effects. But within a decade, New York poetry, as it was called, had become fairly routine, as poet after poet played the game of recounting the day's sights and activities as witnessed on the city streets. You got literally dozens, and you still do. It's my lunch hour, and I walk here, and I see so-and-so, and I say hello, as if that would be enough to really write a good poem. By the later 1970s, in any case, authenticity had become highly suspect. It was the heyday in the U.S. of the post-structuralist turn, and I'm not going to stop and tell you what that was like, but when that came into being, authenticity got to be a dirty word. Nobody wanted to write poetry that was speech-based in this way, and by the time the so-called language poets came on the scene in the late 70s and early 80s, natural speech had become a bad word, natural speech, a phrase of opprobrium. In Stray Dogs and Straw Men, 1976, the chef d'école of the language school, Charles Bernstein, declared emphatically, there is no natural look or sound to a poem. Every element is intended, chosen. That is what makes a thing a poem. And again, there are no thoughts except through language. We're everywhere seeing through it, limited to it, but not by it. Its conditions always interpose themselves, a particular set of words to choose from, a vocabulary, a way of processing those words, syntax, grammar, the natural conditions of language. Now, in what we might call the writerly poetry occasioned by this aesthetic, the representation of speech thus takes a rather different turn. Now, where is the, oh, here. Does it just go this way? Does it? Yeah, okay. So we're going to look at just the first page, or just a very small part of a poem called The Lives of the Toll Takers. And I love that title. Who would write about toll takers? You know, we all know those people taking tolls. If you come from the East Coast, they're even a lot, every road is a toll road, pretty much. So what are the lives of the toll takers? It makes me think of the scene in The Godfather where Sonny is killed, where the toll taker doesn't seem to be there. But anyway, lives of the toll takers. But that isn't really quite what this is about. How this poem works is that they're collaged phrases recorded. They're no longer the simulations of speech, like you said it was hailing, but rather echoes in the poet's consciousness of already existing speech formations. They may be from poems, songs, advertising jingles, citations, often recharged for comic or satiric effect, so as to simulate not actual speech, but the feel of what is heard, processed, and absorbed in everyday conversations. You never know who's speaking here. And this is in a book called Dark City, which came out in the early 90s, Dark City. And I'm only going to talk about just a few lines of it because it's tricky, but I'll read the first part too. There appears, on the first page, there appears to be a receiver off the hook, not that you care. Beside the gloves resided a hat and 2 pinky rings for which no finger was ever found. Largesse with no release became, after not too long, atrophied, incendiary, stupefying. difference or différence? It's the distinction between hauling junk and removing rubbish. Well, I, needless to say, take out the garbage. Pragmatism. And now this is the part I want to look at. Now these next lines, this is a poem about money and about this capitalism, if you will, you know, very, overworked theme today in many ways, but he does it in a very witty way. Phone again, jiggity jig. I figured they do good eggs here. Funny money, making a killing on junk bonds and living to peddle the tale. Victimless rhyme. Laughing all the way to the Swiss bank where I put my money in gold bars. The prison house of language. Simplicity is not the same as simplistic. Sullen supposition, salacious conjecture, slurpy dead deduction, a picture fixture is worth more than 1,000 words. Now, every one of these lines come from something, and one of the difficulties with this poetry, and this is interesting since we have, let's say, a lot of people from Israel here who aren't necessarily going to know New York slang or American slang or little nursery rhymes. And I was with Charles Bernstein recently in China, where he went through not this poem, but a similar one, and kept trying to get the Chinese audience to identify the lines, and of course they couldn't. They didn't know where any of it was from. And you could say that doesn't make a difference, but of course it does, and it's a problem, which we can discuss later. Phone again, jiggity jig is, of course, from the nursery rhyme, home again, jiggity jig. To market, to buy a fat pig, home again, jiggity jig. So it's going to figure here. I figured they do good eggs here. When I read that line, I laugh. It's like walking into one of the little breakfast places on Amsterdam Avenue, and well, I figured they do, we might as well eat here. I figured they do good eggs here. One of his business partners or somebody is talking, but the word figured already, everything is going to be figured. Money, funny money, making a killing on junk bonds and living, we all know living to tell the tale, the cliche, but here, living to peddle the tale. Victimless rhyme instead of victimless crime. And laughing all the way to the bank, of course, is another cliche, but here it's the Swiss bank, which is accurate because that's where people put their money, in gold bars, and then a little reference to Frederick Jameson, the prison house of language. And it goes on in that way. And the crime, it's actually much more cleverly done than you might think, because the crime, which is here, the rhyme, is victimless, in that the victims of Wall Street crime are anonymous and too numerous to specify, making it possible for the winners of the game to laugh all the way, not just to the bank, but to the Swiss bank, where they can put their money in gold bars. You know those ads you always see on television about, don't listen to me, buy gold. Gold is the best thing to buy today. I just heard it yesterday. Swiss banks, we know, are the banks of choice for rich investors. The prison house of language, Frederick Jameson's famous title in his study about Russian formalism, rejecting it, is indeed the house of high finance that imprisons us all, the market discourse of the Wall Street Journal and its cognates. In this context, the toll takers of the title are not only those actual money collectors on the highways performing their mindless routine, but also those whose taking of their fellow creatures takes a toll. So the whole thing is very worked out in that way. Now, Bernstein's poetic language is replete with puns, double entendres, nursery rhyme, and song echoes, bits of popular culture, proverbs, allusions to academic jargon, and so on. It's highly syncretic, complexly figured. It's a difficult poetry that demands deciphering and interpretation. And one difficulty with this poetry and downside of it is the poem kind of goes on. And I've sometimes tried to ask Charles Bernstein, well, could you have ended 3 pages earlier? Or what gives it any kind of form, and doesn't answer that always so well. And I think that can be a problem. It doesn't bother some people, but it certainly has been a stumbling block in some ways. As in the case of O'Hara and New York poetry, Bernstein's own brilliant poetry, when emulated by lesser language poets, could be unnecessarily opaque and even formulaic in its drive to defy normal syntax and the so-called referential fallacy at any cost. Within the next decade, as digital culture and the internet became normative, poets began to rebel against what often looked like not just loading, as in Keats's metaphor, loading every rift with ore, but overloading every rift with ore. In other words, I started hearing a lot of people say, it's too difficult, it's too annoying, there's too much you have to look up or that you should know. And I really did feel that way a little bit in China when he was asking the students what some of these references meant. And of course, they really had no idea and were kind of at sea. And in any case, as the mood changed to the digital and speech was everywhere around, and you couldn't quite condense it, perhaps, or people felt they couldn't, as Charles Bernstein did, much more attention began to be paid to other people's words, or appropriation, citation, retyping, erasing, recycling, sampling, archiving, on all those acts of language manipulation that transform its content and purpose. In terms of classical rhetoric, inventio and elocutio give way to dispositio, choosing, framing, reconstructing. It's a very different poetry that way. Now, much of what passes for conceptual poetry is not very interesting. It's a form of writing that seems easy. You just take a text, say the testimony of a Nazi sea captain, as Heinrich Becker did, or Julian. There is a poem by Ron Silliman using Julian Assange and all that whole story. No doubt there will be one about Snowden. You know, there's one called Guantanamo. It seems easy. You just take some text, put it through some computer program or database, superimpose it on some other text, apply Oulipo rules, and presto, you have a conceptual poem. It's become a sort of easy way out for many people. And I hear, for instance, at SUNY Buffalo, which was what Charles Bernstein had taught, then left, but at SUNY Buffalo, they're now busy analyzing each other's conceptual poems and doing dissertations on them, you know. And I mean, you can do that, but these poems become fairly obvious because they have very particular political points of view. You know, from the title Guantanamo, it's going to be about how miserable and how unfair Guantanamo is. It's not going to be about what rats those people at Guantanamo are or anything like that. You know, I mean, in other words, it can become quite cliched. But there are, as in any movement, some very good exemplars. And the one I'm going to talk about is Kenneth Goldsmith, and this particular one, 7 Deaths and Disasters. It looks like this kind of design, and it's described on its jacket flap inside as a series of prose poems that encapsulate 7 pivotally iconic moments in recent American history. And the 7 moments are the John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy assassinations, John Lennon's assassination, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, the Columbine shootings, 9/11, and the death of Michael Jackson. Impartial reportage, writes the author, is revealed to be laced, and this is, I think, an important point about what Vered brought up to begin with, about speech. Impartial reportage is revealed to be laced with subjectivity, bias, mystery, second-guessing, and in many cases, white-knuckled fear. Part nostalgia, part myth, these words render pivotal moments in American history through the communal lens of media. Now, World Trade Center, and I found myself reading that out loud to someone on the 30th anniversary of 9/11 this last year, in 2014. It's taken from a variety of sources, and the sources are listed at the back. So the sources here are a CNN broadcast, a video. There was actually a video broadcast, and the others are local radio stations. You wouldn't know them. WKAB, various stations in New York. Radio stations. ABC, WOR, WFAN, and WNYC, which is the Good Music Station. At first, anyway, under the technical notes. So you have all those. In his afterword, Goldsmith makes clear that the piece was written by surgically extracting punchy excerpts which seem to embody the spirit of the Fuller tapes. Stumbles and stutters were left intact. That's always a question whether to do that or not. During these readings, I embodied the voice of those radio announcers, reenacting and reclaiming the soundtrack I heard on Bleecker and 6th Street, where the poet was evidently standing, watching the spectacle in utter disbelief. Now, at first, I was very skeptical of Goldsmith's claim that this and the 6 other radio-TV transcriptions could be called prose poems. But the appellation turns out to be perfectly just. The main device is a kind of fugal repetition of words being introduced and repeated again and again. I never realized how much that's done on radio, but it's also because he cut the whole thing enormously. You see, that's why you have to be careful of the intentional fallacy. He'll say, I'm simply transcribing what these radio announcers said. But of course, he's cut it tremendously. He's gotten about 9 hours into less than 1 hour that this piece would be if you read the whole thing out loud. So he isn't really doing the whole thing. So the question is what you cut. The first part modulates certain phrases that are almost Gertrude Stein-like inflections. It's the cover. Okay. Did you see any smoke? Smoke continues to billow. Black smoke is billowing from what appears to be all sides. You can see the smoke billowing out. There are flames billowing out there. And then in a little while you get, I don't see the building because there's an awful lot of thick smoke. So first you see the smoke and then you can't see anything. And soon the descriptive terms give way to the more abstract word explosion is going to come up, a word used again and again as the awful realization that there's a second explosion sinks in. I didn't realize till I read this how the announcers and in general people did not know there were two towers, did not know it had happened to two towers. Everybody thought it was just one. Explosion is in its turn replaced by the verb collapse. Latin is collapse, soon accompanied by simple negatives. I can't tell. I don't see it. I don't see the building. And finally, all attempts to describe what is actually happening give way on WNYC as to the first speculations as to who might have done it, whether it might have been Osama bin Laden. That comes up fairly early, much to my surprise, and what the fate of America will be. Now, the speech of World Trade Center is entirely appropriated. There's not a word that Goldsmith wrote himself, but it's also carefully chosen and structured. It begins as these broadcasts actually begin on a low key. And it begins, I don't think, yeah, at the bottom paragraph there. This just in. You're looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot. That was on CNN. That is the World Trade Center. And we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. A plane crash, devastating, that word is repeated many times, but evidently accidental. For the first few pages, the emphasis is on crash. What kind of a plane was it? Did it have difficulty flying? A question deeply ironic in the context, especially since the eyewitness, one Sean Murtaugh, the vice president of finances at CNN, whose office is on the 21st floor of 5 Penn Plaza, immediately said, yes, it did. It was teetering back and forth, wingtip to wingtip, and it looked like it crashed into maybe the 80th or 85th floor. The reporters can't fathom it. They're wondering why the plane doesn't come out on the other side. I found that very strange. The reporters are constantly saying, well, isn't it going to come out on the other side if it went in here? Because, of course, from a distance, it looks like such a little thing. We'll see the plane coming out the other side in some crashed form, but, of course, it didn't. They will keep wondering why. And only after much pointless information from eyewitnesses as which of the two towers was hit, which one has the top floor observation platform, the news of the second explosion and second tower collapse come in the following passage. We just received word that the South Tower has collapsed. Okay. Wow. The South Tower has collapsed. You'd almost think there was some type of secondary explosion. Ugh. Oh, I mean, that's, here speech breaks down. That would, and you just have to wonder how that's, let's just think about this logically. There is no logic. Oh my God. A hijacked airplane. Now that's the first moment after about 10 pages and about many minutes into the thing that the word hijacked comes up because nobody realized that. Here finally, it's 12 pages into the text, the word hijacked appears for the first time, soon followed by catastrophic as the news of the Pentagon attack and the attack over Pennsylvania comes in. It finally dawns on the radio team in question that the United States could be under attack. I really don't know about you, Joe, says Ed, but I got the shakes. What to say? It's the moment for cliché to weigh in. This is a day that will live in infamy, one of the announcers declares. The morning of this day, the 11th of September, 2001, will live in infamy. Here he's regurgitating Roosevelt's famous words about Pearl Harbor. It's comforting, I suppose, but only for a moment before the recognition sets in that, and then the one announcer says, you don't know who it is, there are no words to express this. Now bear in mind, and he does that throughout this book, the radio announcers who have to suddenly announce, this happens all the time lately, there's some announcer who's going to talk about how to cook your turkey for Thanksgiving. You know, it's some minor disc jockey or something, and then something really terrible happens, and he has to say it, or she has to, and it's very hard because they don't really know what's going on, and they don't understand it, and they've never had to do that kind of reporting, so you get very peculiar. In the John Lennon one, I noticed the people who didn't even know who John Lennon was, just about, reporting that. Now, what to say, there are no words to express this. In part 5 of The Wasteland, the fire sermon, there's a reference to Eliot's Wasteland, there's a reference to the bombing of World War I in the lines, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal, unreal city. Substitute New York for those cities, and it's all quite real or surreal enough. Talk of explosion now gives way to negation. The North Tower has collapsed. Oh yes, it's not there. It's not there. It is not there. We can tell you that there are no towers standing. And now finally, 16 pages into the composition, the word terrorist occurs for the first time. Terrorist attacks, war zone, a situation beyond description. In such situations, language breaks down. The World Trade Center, we hear, has collapsed in, wait, I think I had it on here. No, I didn't. Well, anyway, the line is, has collapsed in clubble. Oh, rubble, clubble, can't even speak. Now, what to say when there's nothing one can say but must keep talking for no better reason than that one is on the air? You have to say something. And how can these unpracticed disc jockeys or other radio heads get at the truth behind the momentary images? Description now gives way to theorizing. Who did it? Was it Islamicists? But look at the Oklahoma bombing, which turned out to be the work of homegrown blonde neo-Nazis. Then again, Lawrence Eagleburger says, and so on. The talk turns to Osama bin Laden. The unspeakable inevitably gives way to rumor and speculation. And then in the final section, section 7, the whole event is framed and distanced. A radio head named George informs his listeners that this afternoon they're not letting reporters anywhere close to the area where the 2 World Trade Towers collapsed earlier today. I'm standing right next to the Manhattan Bridge. And the piece closes with these words. Now, before I read these words, bear in mind in New York, at 911, nobody was allowed to come in on any of the bridges or leave. So everybody was stuck and is wandering around and trying to walk over the Brooklyn Bridge, but they couldn't, and people in New Jersey are in hysterics. But Wall Street, the buildings on Wall Street are so high, it's a cavern, as Hart Crane first called it, the cavern sort of Wall Street, where you see the sun, but you really don't see. And so the piece ends like this, from one of the radio announcers. And just below me in a park right near the edge of Chinatown. And while there's some curiosity among these people, they continue to play their card games. They continue to chat as if nothing is going on. Their markets are open. They're shopping. They're buying their fish. It's as if this little corner of New York City was totally unaffected. But it's at the top of their minds. They're pointing up in the air periodically, and they're continuing with their card games. So it's just a little snapshot of a piece of New York as they deal with this immense tragedy. And that does give you the strangest feeling that right there in Chinatown, and that is the way it was, people didn't even know yet. There was no radio coming through, and it's quiet. And I guess you could smell some smoke, but probably not because the buildings block it out. And so they're there. And in that part, nobody knows what's going on yet. It's a kind of hyper-real, the irony of the hyper-real. In almost every account of 9/11 available, whether by journalists or poets, by ordinary bystanders or government officials, the text culminates in horror or despair, often laced with moralism. But the fact is that in the cavern of Wall Street and its surroundings, the tall buildings make it impossible to see anything at a distance. And so local neighborhoods like Chinatown are self-contained, here comes everybody, and protected. The billowing smoke evidently didn't reach this area. Ironically, although no one can get either into Manhattan or out, although smoke and fire can be seen from miles away, in Chinatown people, George tells us, whoever George is, are playing cards and buying fish. Life, in this instance, goes on. Now, Goldsmith's World Trade Center condenses roughly 9 hours of broadcasting from 9 a.m., the first crash occurred at 8:46 a.m., to about 6 p.m. in less than an hour's worth of actual reading time, 27 pages, but keeps the exact wording and broken rhythm of the originally jerky, jittery texts that Goldsmith transcribes. The poet has not invented a single word, but he has selected his text fragments very carefully. We thus have the sensation of witnessing the event as it happens and as it is mediated. We are there, knowing no more than what the broadcast teams can tell us. What thus emerges for our contemplation is a tale of horror much worse than that of a natural disaster. For the most blatant failure we learn in the course of the piece is that of intelligence. How could no one have known what was happening? And no one seems to. The shrewd suppositions about bin Laden near the end only make it worse. The government was not only literally but figuratively in exile. And security at the World Trade Center, which had already been an object of attack 10 years earlier, seems to have been non-existent. Then again, at this media moment, who knows? Goldsmith's conceptual prose poem, I would argue, gives us a much more vivid presentation of what it felt like to experience the events of 9/11 than a more conventional lyric poem or short story could do. At least all the poems I've seen about that are always, oh, how horrible and how terrible, and, you know, work in certain ways and make analogies and can leave you kind of cold, really. The real speech of the protagonist, so bland, repetitive, fragmented, unimaginative, doesn't summarize or draw moral lessons. It simply is, its very momentum defining the public consciousness of the moment. Part parody ode, part satire, part science fiction and reportage, the speech reproduced in World Trade Center is nothing, to me, very moving. You, dear reader or listener, are there, living through the events. The poet need not comment in his own person for you to experience the uncertainty, fear, and horror. Now, conceptual writing like Goldsmith's is very much of our moment, but I'll stop with this and say this, but it's perhaps best understood as a clearing of the ground, the mediated ground before the return of lyric sets in again. I really have come to believe these things do work dialectically. When you had language poetry, it couldn't keep going on in that vein. Language poetry was a particular reaction against 70s and 80s hyper sort of boring, you know, lyric that had very little to say and was all about the death of my grandfather or this, always beginning with those horrible anecdotes like yesterday my wife found a spider in the refrigerator. You know, I'm not making that up. I mean, you really hear those things. I was listening to a reading the other day with John Ashbery, but first it was Mark Ford, British poet, who's highly considered in Britain, and he began by telling also, what was the story? Oh, I can't even think of what it was now, but some little anecdote that I thought, oh my goodness, I mean, that's not very good taste, really, what is the point? And then you change to your poetry voice, you know, and then you start reading that way. So that language poetry was a reaction against that awful kind of poetry where the little anecdote and the poetry uniform and the threadbare notebook and the pretense that you don't know what you're going to read, that, well, no, I think I'll read, no, you know, whatever. And of course they've planned it all. And that was a sort of real thing, and that's the kind of thing Charles Bernstein and poets reacted against. But the reaction was set in the other way. And so now we have all this conceptual poetry, and I think there's also going to be a reaction, there already is, against that. Charles Bernstein has recently written some wonderful ballads about the death of his daughter Emma that are not really like his earlier language poems so much. Goldsmith himself is about to bring out a book called Capital, which is a kind of ode to New York. It's all taken from other sources. And the things are like in Walter Benjamin, there's a chapter called Light, a chapter called Traffic, all the various things, Bridge, as in Walter Benjamin, and he doesn't say what the sources are, but you get a picture of New York, and that's a very different kind of work, again, a kind of arcades project. And Goldsmith's co-editor of the Conceptualist anthology, Craig Dworkin, has just published a long poem called The Pine Woods Notebook, a meditation on the meaning of the monosyllabic words pitch and pine as both tree and emotional longing, to see where the two intersect and to define the chemical composition of the pine grove in all its coolness and distinct scent. Generated according to a set of alphabet rules or built on the most arcane words found in the dictionary, the Pine Woods Notebook is at once esoteric and familiar, a mock epic version of such romantic conversation poems as Coleridge's The Lime Tree Bower, My Prison. Its short lines of strophes separated by white space, speech rhythms and contours be aphorisms, scientific descriptions and contours being notably absent. This is not the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings of Wordsworth, but a set of subtly sounded phrases and sentences generated with dictionary and with various rules. So let's call it conceptual lyric, perhaps, a kind of new form in that way. In the words of the poem, the several denotations are seduced to commute. The several denotations are seduced to commute. And so I think this is where we're going now. And in there, speech, to get back to what is supposed to be our topic, and like the Pinewood Notebook, it's once again, I would say, a kind of writerly mode where you don't think in terms of recorded speech so much at all, but think on the contrary of poetry being written, even though also heard, but written composition. So once something hits a certain, I just say one last thing, which is this. Just as I was working on this, something came through on Facebook. A man named Danny Snelson, who Michael will know, some of you might know here, called Epic Lyric Song, which came through on Facebook. And here's the title to it, the explanation. Epic Lyric Poem. Danny Snelson is at Penn, is a graduate student finishing at Penn, his PhD. Epic Lyric Poem draws from an SQL, I don't know what SQL is, what is it? What? Okay. SQL database torrent distributed to create pop lyric websites, presumably to make ad money, primarily created by fans. A Python script was used to draw out every line with the string lyric in this database. Each of these lines was then standardized to 55 characters, the average length of a line in a pop song. The poem is 55 stanzas and so forth, and it's based on Alexander Pope. Now, I happen to love Pope. I don't know how many of you know Pope well, and I love The Rape of the Lock, which this is based on. So I have to say, please don't tell it back to him. I hope this isn't being recorded. Is this being recorded? Oh, dear. Well, then maybe I won't say. Please cut it. You know, he's a very sweet guy, and there are people who are going to admire this a lot. But if you remember The Rape of the Lock, here's his sort of parody beginning, without the database yet. What dire offense from poetical causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I sing, this verse to lyric muse is due. This even database may vouchsafe to view. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise. That's from The Rape of the Lock. If she inspire and he approve my lays. Say what strange motive goddess could compel a well-read user to assault, and in the original is a gentle bell, but here it's gentle doggerel. Or say what strange a cause yet unexplored could make gentle lyric reject its lord. In task so bold this little poem engages, in its soft prosody queries what this ages. And then we get 55 stanzas that are all going to go something like this. Don't worry, I'm only going to read 2 lines. My murderous lyrics equipped with the spirits before me. I mold the lyrics flowing like blood through the artery. Lace them with lyrics that's legendary musical mercenary. Lyrically performing lobotomy on your biology, a prodigy. Lyrical attack, a heavyweight lyric, never lost a calorie. And so on, you get the point. Use the database, you put in those words. Now, I have to say, maybe I'm just too old for this, but I have to say, I don't think this is where, somebody's going to argue with me, I don't think this is where poetry is going to go. Because it seems too easy, and people used to write parodies like this all the time. I mean, you know, when you had serious poems, you had parodies of Wordsworth, you had parodies of Yeats, you have parodies all the way through of Edgar Allan Poe, brilliant parodies, and I really don't see, I mean, it's fun. You know, he's having a lot of fun here. But is that going to be a substitute for poetry? And so I would conclude by saying that from where I sit, and I'm sure many of you will argue with this, poetry is at a difficult stage right now. You know, we're not going to have great poetry at every moment of every century in every country. And I think there are countries today like Brazil, where from what I can tell, poetry is alive and well. Maybe in Israel, I don't really know, but I'll take your word for it. It is very alive and well. In the United States, it's at a difficult turning point, and we really need a revolution. We need the kind of revolution we had in 1910, where Pound did the men of 1910. You were not allowed to say the men of 1910, but if you go back and read Pound and Eliot and Wallace Stevens and Williams today, they still, you know, are, I think, great poets. So I don't really think that this, I mean, it's fun, and I'm glad Danny Snells is having fun, and we don't have to take it too seriously, but I wouldn't want to see everybody in whatever workshop start writing conceptually this way. There's something too easy about it, you know? Anyway, I'll stop there. Having burned my bridges. Please don't record that.
I really am delighted and honored to introduce one of my favorite Hebrew poets, Amir's and Veret's too, I suppose, Zali Gurevitch, who also happens to be a professor emeritus of anthropology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a thinker and scholar in the utopian sense of the term, incurably curious, independent, and experimentalist in a profound yet funny and playful way. These qualities are to be found in both his essayistic work and his poetry. When Zali speaks, even over coffee, I'm always driven to optimism by his combinations of what is funny and what is beautiful. His essays and books in Hebrew includes Al Hamakom, where Hamakom means in Hebrew both the place and God, one of the most quoted articles in the small yet vivid arena of the humanities in Israel. A book on Kohelet, this is a tough word, Ecclesiastes. Wow. A book on Song of Songs, and a book called Sicha, a conversation on the essence of conversation, dibur. In the context of Professor Perloff's talk, I would like to add here that Zali's phrase, getting out of the trip of the self, it's לצאת מן הטרנס של האני, getting out of the trip of the self, was definitely a milestone in the history of Hebrew poetry and criticism as an alternative possibility to the mainstream poetics in Israel. Zali also translated English poetry. He translated an entire book of poems by John Ashbery and poems by Charles Olson and Yeats. He also translated from French Francis Ponge, and some of his own work was translated to English. Zali Gurevitch has many interests and talents, but he chose to be, first and foremost, a Hebrew poet. He doesn't, in his poetry, he doesn't place himself as a representative of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, or even the Hebrew language. However, they are always his point of origin, the concept before all concepts. The loyalties for beginnings, for the problem of origin, of the root in the pre-Socratic way, including the linguistic root, are at the heart of his work. The insistence and exploration of the essential, while offering an open invitation for any reader to participate in the game of finding new ways to start all over again and again, from one beginning to the next, characterize all of the 10 books of poetry Zali Gurevitch published so far. So let's begin from the beginning. Please welcome Zali Gurevitch.
I'm limited to the poetry that has been translated into English. And I chose to begin, or maybe also to end, with a book that came out 10 years ago, in 2005, which was slightly before that was also the Iraq War. So the CNN and the statements of the CNN are in this book. But I'll explain to you from what angle, from what perspective, not from this perspective, but from a different perspective. The book is called Time Baba in English, in Hebrew, Zman Baba. And before I read a few excerpts, I would like to tell you where it began, so sort of to create a certain context for the reading. I don't have someone like you who will create the context for me, so I have to do it myself. Actually, the book began at the end of a previous book, which was all written, was all laid down on the page. But at the end of it, I wrote a coda, like a musical coda. The coda is the Italian word, or the Latin word. But in Hebrew, it's really a tale, as coda means. So the book wanted a tale, because a book needs a tale. This is what we miss. We don't have tales. And actually writing is something that is done with a tail, as your tongue is your forward, your front tail. The way I thought of tailing, let's call it this way, the end of this book, was not to add something, a piece of poetry, which will serve as a tale. I actually drew a tale. And I drew a tale by sort of making little sentences, little idioms, by words which I used only the first letter of the word. So it became contracted. And then what happened was that when the tail sort of curved up, because my tail at that moment, I mean, each one has many tails, but the tail at that moment went up. And when it sort of came close to the tip of the tail, because every tail has a tip, suddenly I wrote, this was like few letters, because it was just the initial letters of words. In Hebrew, Ze lo dada, ze baba. This is not dada, this is baba. I have no idea where this came from. Even though baba is baba, and dada is dada. But why this is not dada, this is baba, remains a riddle. It took me a while to realize that actually the whole book that was already written was only an introduction to this little phrase, this is not dada, this is baba. And the book was cancelled. What remained was only this. Ze lo dada, ze baba. This is not dada, this is baba. And the question that I had to start with was, what on earth is baba? How do I go with baba? I knew that this is the path, that this is the abracadabra word for a new book or a new work or something. But what was it? I had to decipher it while writing it. As Reski, I think Theodor Reski says, you learn by walking where you have to go. Now, the word that I connected with Baba was the word time. It's time, Baba. And the word time is important because, in a way, this became the most important word in this book. And time in different ways. First of all, time Baba is the zeitgeist. As time Baba, this is the era, the Baba era. It's a different time. It's not the time of Dada. It's a different time. It's a Baba time. It's a time Baba. And the difference that somehow became clear between Dada and Baba is that Dada, from Tzara's, you know, and the hobby horse and the French hobby horse and the childish talk and the evacuation of meaning from syllables of sound, which brings about endless play and construction and deconstruction and destruction playing together with each other. But when you say Dada, you refer mainly to child expression and to children playing around and messing around. And you mess around. It's wonderful. I love Dada. I love Dada. I think that this is the most important revolution in poetry that occurred in the 20th century. Dada. I think that they open, not that the poetry that they wrote is so important, but the experiment, the experiment comes from peril in English, like experience. It comes from peril. And the perilousness, the sense of danger, the sense of that you open something, you open a box that you don't know what's in it. And you don't know if it's a Pandora box or if it's a box of treasures. And you open it and suddenly everything flies in the air and you can do anything. You can stand on your head, you can ruin, you can paint, you can dance, you can mock, you can do anything. But Baba adds another whole notion to Dada. And this is Baba is also old. Dada is only child. But Baba is also child, like baby. But it's also Bobe. And it's also Baba, the man with the beard is Baba. I was walking near the Ganga River in Varanasi And I was walking down the stairs, and there was a sadhu, a holy man, wholly naked, but all covered and smeared with gray ash. Only his hands, his palms, and his feet were unashed. And he was looking at me going down, and he says, "Baba, Baba, come smoke with me," which I did. But the term of Baba as the bearded man, or as it is used, Baba is father, Baba is also grandfather. So there is for me a combination of the young and the old, of that which is modernism, which is before, which is towards, and postmodernism, which is after. And this is the old looking at. So it's not just play, it's a serious play. And serious play has, as the word serious that comes from schwer, right? It comes from heaviness. And there is a certain kind of heavy-headedness, or a kind of seriousness, kind of a serious play. By the way, the word serious in Hebrew is only 100 years old. It's 100 years old, which you have to imagine that for thousands of years,
It was so serious they didn't need
they didn't need the word. But there was no word for serious. There was heavy-headed, maybe. But Ben Yehuda, what he did is that he took the Arabic root of razin, which means really heavy-headed. It's like shver, it's the same, it's heavy-headed. He added the word will, wanting, which is ratzon. He added the meaning of Ratzin, was the king of Aram in the Bible, and he made a combination, a kind of a cocktail.
Sounds like Israel.
Right, exactly. He made some kind of cocktail, and he called it Ratzin, which has become Retzini afterwards. But now you cannot have a conversation without using a word that is only 100 years old, which is amazing. So Baba is kind of a serious play. It's a kind of Dada and Baba together. Second thing, or maybe third, or who knows, who counts, is that time Baba, or the time that I felt that is something new, that it is experimental for me, or maybe not only for me. We are all experimenting with something. Not always do we know what we are experimenting with or what for. But that it's the first book that I wrote without paper, only in the computer. The first time, and I have to remember that, I don't know, poetry is associated with the pen or the pencil and the page and etc., etc. And there is a certain kind of idea or notion of purity with that. But so to shift to a computer was for me a very strange step. Not only that, but by shifting to the computer itself became part of the poem. And the computer itself first by the mechanical time that the screen presents. That is, if it's time Baba, so the chain of thoughts or the chain of association or the chain of things that come, that's where the CNN comes. Because when you write on the computer, so the shift from the page you're writing or the writing itself, you move to I don't know, to CNN, or you move to a paper, and you get information which at the moment, yes, they're sort of molten into what you're writing, and they become parts of like radio, TV talk that are part of what is going because it's part of the time. And then the whole poem is קטעים, like fragments. Like fragments, some of them are rhymed and some of them are just story and some of them are imported from other sources and are other people's speech. But there is a chain of time, the whole thing, sometimes with differences of minutes. And it's amazing what happens in the mind when you document it, when you report it, the amazing moves that can happen from one thing to another in the space of 2 minutes. And then you have the rush, actually, the rush of poetry, or the rush of thoughts, or the rush of what is happening. To the extent, and with this I will close the introduction, that what came out of this is that every fragment became a baba. So a baba became not only a notion or a concept, but it became a poetical form. So that actually I'm producing babas, or the babas are coming to me. And not that I can say what is a baba, but this is it.
I'm sure you know it's a door in Aramaic.
It's what?
A door. Baba. Baba.
A door, like bab. Like bab. Bab is a gate, right. Yeah, bab is a gate. Yes. Like also in the Talmud, actually. Yes.
But it's also a woman. Baba.
Baba.
Baba in Russian.
Like Baba Yaga.
No, but every married woman is a baba.
Married woman is a baba?
Married woman, unlike a girl, unmarried. And
She's Dada.
She's not. Married woman is baba.
Be careful.
Yeah, and
It's good to be Dada.
that's where the baba, the Yiddish baba word comes from the Russian baba,
Yeah.
or Slavic baba.
Babushka.
Babushka.
Babushka. Okay. So I'll read. So these are excerpts, and you know, it's sometimes
Talking about Alibaba.
Alibaba. No, when you start thinking about Baba, it has more associations in various channels than Dada. Dada is basically limited in its association as the word itself, but Baba is all over the place. It's like in the West, and it's in the East, it's far and it's close. It's like this room is filled with Baba without you knowing it. So anyway, time Baba, and sometimes the jump from the excerpt that were translated, sometimes it's 40 pages apart or something, but I hope it sort of gives you the spirit. Maybe I'll start with Hebrew, so it will get me into it. 2 בפברואר 2003, 19:02. אני משתחווה לזמן, האחד והיחיד שלא משתחווה. בעצם, אני לא משתחווה. אם הוא לא משתחווה, לא משנה לו. מי שמשנה לו, שישתחוו לו, בעצמו משתחווה. ניישר אם כן גבות, זה מה שקשה. התעמלות פואטית להרחבת הערב. מתיחת ידיים, פיקוק חוליות, נשימה עמוקה. מה עמל היום? איפה אנחנו עומדים? מה יש? עוד מוקדם. למסך יש שעון למטה מימין. 19:09. לא שירת סטילס, שירת מסך, שירת וידאו. הצטלמתי בדמיון, נוזל מהכורסה בכוך ומתיישב על הרצפה על התחת ליד התנור. קשה להאמין שעד לכאן הגענו. ממש קשה להאמין. מי היה מאמין? מי היה העובר הראשון שקדם לאמו, שקדם לראות הרוח לכל הרעיון? של מי הייתה הרוח הראשונה? רוח העובר. אין לזה וידאו. רק הזמנים משתנים. השתנו הזמנים. הייתי שם, בכפר יחזקאל, כשלתדהמתי, במקום הסוס הידוע, עמד ליד הרפת טרקטור אדום. החזיקו עוד את הסוס איזו תקופה, אולי מתוך ידידות. אני חייתי עד גיל 36, עד שראיתי מחשב PC, אצל ד' ברחוב פרנסוס, בברקלי הילס. זה היה זר לי לגמרי. הוא נתן לי לגעת במקלדת, לתופף קלות על המנעניים. 19:21. אוקיי. English. I can't hear myself reading my poetry in English, but that's what's going to happen. The translator is, her name is Gina Franco, and she's an American poet with a Mexican origin, whom I met in a college, and she together, I mean, she doesn't know Hebrew, so actually her English and my Hebrew. I bow before time, the one who never bows. On second thought, I don't bow. If he doesn't bow, he won't mind. He who minds being bowed to himself bows. Let's straighten our backs then. That's what's hard. The poetic workout, stretching out the evening, back stretching, knuckle cracking, deep breath. What's the day's yield? Where do we stand? What's up? It's still early. There is a clock at the bottom of the screen. 1909. Not stills poetry, screen poetry, video poetry. Had in my head a film of me spilling down from the armchair to the floor, sitting on my ass near the stove. Hard to believe what we've come to. Really hard to believe. Who would have believed? Who was the first fetus who came before its mother, came before the idea? Whose was the first spirit, the spirit of the fetus? Of that, there is no video. Only times change. Times are changing. I was there in the village when, dumbstruck, I saw by the barn, instead of the horse, stood a red tractor. They kept the horse for a while, perhaps out of friendship. I lived to be 36 before I saw a PC, a D's on Parnassus Street in Berkeley Hills. It was completely strange to me. He let me touch the keyboard, lightly tap the keys. 1921. Empty lot, junkyard, no way of knowing what's going on. The kingdom of hesitation, voiding of direction, vagrancy. Crossroads in India, no hat with a tail, impossible to know what to say exactly. 1925. Stop. That too is time. 1927. Wanna come? I'm going there too. 1928. How to say beautiful without sweetness? What beauty! So beautiful. Oh, my brother said to me earlier, write a book of nonsense, and danced it with his hands. 2nd of May, 2003, 0108. Baba, the fool in the empty. What remains after everything is emptied? The maximum of the minimum. Piano keys flying in dispersion. 22:55. As if any minute someone can come and take me, get me out of it. There is hope in this too. Not to stay, not to be closed in, not even as Kafka imagines in he, inside the cage whose space between bars is metered, meaning it is possible to get out. 1513. The curtain is rising. Poetry is just a magic word to raise the curtain. 1822. Black feathers flying in the air. Graffiti in Pompeii from the early 70s of the first centuries. A blackboard as is after the lesson nobody stays to look at. Notes, pads, diaries, all that. Black and white drawings that were not actually written. Frescoes on the wall from within, like mirrors, dreams that only you can see, though not always. Everyone wants their feet on the ground. But what about being in the air? On the ground in the air? 2046. Air poetry, 2048. The back on the chair, the ass in the air, the legs crossed left over right on the table, 2103. For tonight, the exercise is as follows. Stand for a moment, spread your arms from your sides, now slowly, slowly begin in movements of wings, not of an airplane, but of a bird, until you feel you're light and elevating. Don't stop the movement. You can go a bit faster now and start looking for a direction. Don't force your body. Let it just think high and your body will fly. 0, 0, 0, 0. You wanted a Baba? Here is your Baba. 2107. In India, it comes back on the steps going down to the Ganga. A naked man, bearded, tall, handsome, all anointed with gray-white ash. Only his hands and feet washed clean, palms sticking out from sleeves, sitting in a tent at the bottom of the stairs by the river, preparing for himself a pipe of hashish, caught me by the eye going down the steps and called me, Baba, Baba. Baba, his beard is old, his baby. Come smoke with me in my tent. 2127. There was a storm that night. The chimneys of the sky broke. Rain came down not in laces, but in heaps, in stacks. The whole upper lake poured down at once. The clouds emptied. Phone calls one after another to ask if we are all right. Mega. Phone, if we are all right. A Palestinian blew himself up in a bus near Klal Center. 16 people killed, 100 injured. 11 June 2003. Here are the top stories for this evening. Breaking news, fucking breaking news. 2135. I find myself talking to A, who died in the explosion. Not exactly talking, somehow beside her, moaning. 0154. The shame of words. 0207. Words have no shame, and shame has no words. A few babas are making their way this very moment as we speak, scuffling in the dark. Some unknown, but those that are arrive as if they've covered no distance, even if years are behind them, as if they've just been born, a road jump. Suddenly their time has come and they show up out of free will and tie themselves to the pier. 1913. Maybe I'll... one more and we'll call it a day. The moderns, and more so the postmoderns, don't like depth. Depth is an illusion. The depth of things, deep people, deep thought, the depth of landscape, of perspective. Because depth invites digging, penetration, sneaking in, entrance, arrival, coming, as if there is where to come from, someone to come to. There is none. No depth, no secret. The deep of the sea, yes, because it can be mapped, measured, stretched out. Not in depth is their interest then, but on surface, the breadth of plains, the folds of the brain, the open-ended fields, the faces of the page. Let scientists have the outside and poets the inside. That is their field. 1249. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes, 10 minutes for discussion.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these wonderful, wonderful things. I just want to say Snowden already was pre-written in Catch-22. There's like this phrase, the recurring phrase, "Where are the Snowdens of yesteryear?" Yeah. Right? Which is, it's just like there.
Proleptic intellectuality.
But what struck me in both your both the poetry you're reading, which is of course about 2003, is of course is this. I mean, this 9/11, especially the last part, the 9/11 scenario is very familiar to us, to anybody in Israel, and especially in 2003, the time of the Baba time, which was the time of these exploding buses, which is probably sort of another form of Baba. And it's all too familiar. Yeah, bomba, yeah. The bus, and it's all.
Bomba, also bomba.
Yeah. And it's all too familiar, this thing where the speech on television is impossible, right? This idea, this really the vacuity of language, but of the image, everything becomes totally vacuous. In this you can't hear it, you can't listen to it, you can't, and it really is. It's sort of the minor miracle of restoring feeling to this kind of use of language, this obscene use of language. And I was thinking about it as you were speaking that, I mean, choosing and framing is not enough to explain what goes on. There's something. There's something else. I don't have an answer. I have a question. I mean, what is really going on there? It's not just choosing and framing. It's not just editing. It's a new form of.
Well, why do you say just? Why just?
Well, because that has been done. But that is something that has always been done. Choosing and framing is always. I mean, even Thucydides does that, right? He chooses and frames. And here we are in front of a new phenomena. There is something new going on. In the way we consume news and the way then it can become poetry. That's why I'm saying just, but I don't know what it is. So I'm asking.
Oh wow, it's a big question. I think there is that sense that there's so much language. I mean, this is Kenneth Goldsmith's argument. There's so much language out there now that none of us can even absorb it, and there's so much more information than knowledge. That's something very important, I think, that we have all this information. You can look up in 2 minutes things on Wikipedia, that are very good, and I'm not knocking it at all. When you quickly want to know something, I hear lots of lectures where I think I could have looked that up in Wikipedia in 5 minutes and known more than sitting through maybe somebody, going through a whole thing. So there is so much, and the idea that everything is recorded, which makes me very nervous. I was thinking about that afterwards. Can I never speak anywhere anymore and say anything I think and think I'm speaking? Now let's talk about speech and audience, where if I think my audience are the very nice people in this room and sort of sympathisch people in this room, and then you think by the time this happened to me recently at a reading at the Grolier Club, then somebody recorded it. I didn't know anybody was recording that. And so then everybody who goes on Facebook or everything else knows exactly what you've said, which of course is a way of cheapening language terribly, and it begins to have a whole new sense. And I don't know what the answer to all that is either, because you can say in some ways poetry will always be poetry, always will be the same, and choice, it's just that at some periods some things are more important than others. There's some periods where imagery is very important for all kinds of reasons. This is not such a period, maybe because we have so much imagery and visual imagery. I think some of the best poetry that's being written today is visual poetry. I do think there are marvelous things being done, and maybe that is because this is a very visual time. I don't mean things written for the computer, but I mean things that you can do by juxtaposing things. For instance, a wonderful work, I was going to bring this in today, but I didn't, that by a Brazilian poet named André Valias, who I got to know very well in Brazil, who started as a designer actually, but among other things he's done is translate all of Heinrich Heine into Brazilian. There's a feat. Big fat book, incredible, very difficult poet to translate. Anyway, he put together a thing called Takeltakt, where he took Georg Trakhl's poetry, read simultaneously in Brazilian and English, in German and Portuguese, and then took Wittgenstein's letters to Trakl, where Wittgenstein wanted so much to meet Tuckle, and by the time he got to the place in the front where Tuckle was dead. And then Benjamin's famous essay on translation transformed into a sort of Wittgensteinian work with proposition numbers, which makes the Benjamin essay look really silly and kind of funny. And then there's music by Webern, and there all these things, and then there's syntactic, they're graphs, and these things are juxtaposed on each other. Tuckle, and I thought, now you can say, is that really a poem? Well, but it is choosing, and the way he put it together, you get a very sad, wonderful sort of historic picture, because all those things did go together. Benjamin was interested in Tuckle. That's the key, and these letters go together with other things. And then you hear the poems read in two languages, and you always hear different poems read, and you have a great sense of having had a poetic experience. I can't quite tell you how. But it is partly choice. When I say choice, I think that's not such a little thing. You know, there's a famous passage in Wittgenstein where it's in Culture and Value, but it was in what's called the Kringelbuch, where he says, nothing is more interesting, would be more interesting, than to watch a man cross a room, light a cigarette, go to the other side of the room, sit down in a chair, and if you could really capture exactly what's going on somehow, think how interesting that would be, and how interesting, in fact, if we really watch, if we really describe, and that's of course what poets do, and if we really catch that. The problem is things are always sort of covered over by rhetoric. Now I think one of the great thing that people try to do in poetry today is get away from that horrible mediated discourse which we all hear every minute, you know, on television about, I mean, even the very word choice, I'm surprised there really isn't more written on it, because people don't die anymore, you know, they transition. Really, I mean, that's what is said by health services and so forth, that you don't die. Heaven forbid anybody would die. You transition. And serious, the word serious, it's an interesting instance that way, but everything has to be put in these ridiculous terms. And so that, of course, the poet would be somebody who would criticize, and the language poets always said that's what they were doing, is criticizing the basic discourse of the society. Then other people came along, though, and said, come on, you're not doing any more than certain ads are doing that also select language and also choose. So it's a very tricky question. And I don't myself think that something like the 7 Discourses I read, I think it's very interesting work. Will it live? Will it have a life 20 years from now? I'm not so sure, but then I'm not so sure what will. And that's the very tricky part today. Partly there's just so much material. And I think myself, you know, I don't know how to deal with all that material. And when Vera had raised the issue to begin with about global, one of the great ironies of the day is that everything is supposed to be global, but nobody knows a word of any other language. Unless people know languages, nothing is global. And I can't stand listening to all this all the time, which we have at the MLA, you know, and everything. It is not global because they're only doing it in English. And anybody who knows any other language knows that when you hear it translated, you're missing a lot of nuances. You're not really getting it. It's just different, and you can put over all kinds of things. So, and especially in poetry, of course, in fiction, it's less important. So there isn't really globalism. You just have emphasis on different things. Notice with all the talk of globalism, as far as the United States goes, it's always English-speaking countries. It's India, it's Pakistan, it's British, you know, or, you know, Jamaica, or it's Africa, but it's not going to be other countries because they don't know the language. And so, you know, who are we really fooling with all this? And at the same time, we also have to realize that today, and I find this all the time, people don't know the most basic things anymore about Europe, about European writing, or even where the countries are. Even where the countries are. I've heard people say, where is Switzerland? Is that near France? No, I'm not making that up. I mean, it's really, you know, you're living at that kind of time, where on the one hand, there's all this information, and you can look everything up every minute. But as far as knowledge goes, it's very limited. And so where does poetry come into this? I think one of the things that I would like to see much more of, and it could be, you know, in a way you could say Danny Snelson did try that with Pope, is you have to know earlier poetry. You can't really write poetry. It's all intertextual. You can't write, there can't really be poetry if you don't know any earlier poetry. And any poetry of any other countries. So the things that are constantly being said today about how original they are, and this is the first time this has been done. No, it isn't. It was done 80 years ago by Klebnikov in Russia, or whatever, you know, things that are now always being touted as being brand new. So it would have to be taught very differently. But the problem is that most poetry today is taught by poets. Forgive me, but I think that is a problem. It is a problem. I mean, Mike Goldsmith said, we're among the last people who teach poetry, and Johanna goes, oh, maybe you do write poetry, I don't know, who aren't themselves poets. But when the poets are teaching it from the creative writing angle, the novel is not usually taught by novelists. That novel still tends to be taught as a scholarly subject. But when poetry is only taught by other poets, they first of all have an agenda. And what I find, now this is just about America now, is in the poetry workshops, even with the best will in the world that some of my friends give, they're only doing contemporary poets. And then they do a little modernism. So people may know Eliot and Yeats or Pound, but the mid-century has vanished completely. That's a long century, you know. There's a lot of work there. And it is really not known. And because they're not going to do it, the poets aren't going to do it, isn't their immediate concern. And it also isn't their heritage in a funny way. So, you know, you get this kind of thing. So all you can do is just do the best you can and figure, you know, do as much as you can and figure must learn something about what's going on in other countries. Now, it is very hard. I know it's hard for me, let's say about Israel, not knowing a word of Hebrew, then it's very hard. I try to only read poetry in languages. I do know about 4 or 5 languages where at least I know a little bit, like Portuguese where I can. I don't read poetry in Polish poetry. I'm sure there's wonderful Polish poetry, but I can't read it. And I hate to say that, but I do feel in translation it's not really the same thing. Now when I work right now in my book on Celan, probably what's considered the best translation of the latest Celan is Pierre Joris. And Pierre's very good. He's been doing it for 50 years. He's from Luxembourg, so he's really trilingual, and it's very good. But I felt when the poems I worked on, I retranslated all of them. They just weren't, I mean, maybe you can say no translation is ever satisfactory, but I wanted to give as literal a translation as possible so people would know what Celan himself had said. And I would find, I'll give you an example, that was, die Maus quiekt, squeals. And he translated that as squeaks. Well, squealing isn't squeaking. And that sounds like a little thing, but I translated it back because I wanted it to be right? So when you're only reading poetry in translation, you're really not, you're reading somebody else's version, which may be very interesting, but I really don't think you can get it in translation. And so if you want it to be global, it's not going to be really global in any way at all. And so I just consider all that talk of globalism.
You can get the word Baba in translation.
You can get the word Baba. You can get certain things in it also depends if you know.
It needs no translation.
It needs no translation, so that part is good. And then there are languages that you have some familiarity with. I do know some Russian, so you could say the Polish, the Slavic, I could understand slightly. But I think let's look at it from the other side now, from the point of view of the poets. Certainly some of the greatest poets have been people who did read numbers of languages, who did know other languages. That makes a huge difference. Celan himself, although he would only write in German, translated French brilliantly, translated Emily Dickinson, translated Danish, all kinds of things. And there has to be a sense... What?
And spoke Yiddish.
Yeah, some of the best things that have been written on American poetry are by Scandinavians. Well, that's not so surprising because they speak English well, but they have another angle on it too. There's a wonderful magazine called OEI, big fat thing, like a yearbook actually, an annual, that comes out from Stockholm, that has some of the best things in it I've seen in various languages as much as I can tell. And Swedish I can more or less make out, the combination of German, not impossible. But the Scandinavians have done a great deal to promote our poetry. So that's the way globalism works. Somebody can promote somebody else's poetry if there's some relationship, but there has to be some relationship. And so I know that sounds like a downer, but I think as far as Hebrew goes, I don't know whether you know, do you know Rachel Bach?
Yes.
Yes, and she's that poet. Who's the poet she's just translated? Big fat.
I translated her into Hebrew.
What?
I translated her poetry into Hebrew.
Really?
Really.
See, that's great. That's a small book. And she's translated, and she keeps wanting me to review this poet. Who is the poet she just... Right. And I would like to help her because I really like Rachel, and I think she's a very interesting poet, interesting critic.
She did her PhD on Susan Howe.
Right, on Susan Howe, and she's very good. But I can't read this, really. I can't tell quite what he's like. I know that's a downer. But
Austro-Hungarian.
Really? I know she told me that too. I know, but see, I can't.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the solution to that is, and that's my fault, and I think it can be done. I always say this to people: is learn a little of the language. You can. I could, and if I were younger, I would learn some Hebrew. I learned Russian. I took 6 weeks of Russian. I wouldn't say I know it, but I certainly know enough that I know the Cyrillic alphabet. I know how it sounds. I can listen to recordings of Mayakovsky and tell you you can do it. So I always say to people, I said this to Charles Bernstein because he's always trying to sort of do translations of German poems. Well, learn some German. 6 weeks. It's a lot of fun. I think learning another language is the most fun because you're using a different part of your brain. It's like doing math, you know. You cheat a little and take those tests and all that. That's what I do. But I'm very glad I did it, and I think that is what we ought to do, is get people to learn, you know, if they're interested in Baudelaire, you don't just read Walter Benjamin, you learn some French and read Baudelaire, you know.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a downer because I think it's, first of all, we have a conversation, which I wasn't sure we will ever. I mean, when we started, we didn't know where we're going. And your question definitely was something that created the conversation. So, and we're just starting. It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, sorry.
We promised people that we'll be done by 6, but it's just the beginning of these 2 days. So we'll let you have the last word if you want.
How do you feel about that language problem?
No, not the one word. But in order for it really to be,
I agree with the languages, and I know on my part that this is an important issue. But there is another issue, which is not only globalism and the spread of languages and the how do you call it, odef, like the too much information, the surplus of things, that we cannot contain and we cannot. But there is a way to play with it. That's one thing. And the other thing I'm curious about, you said toward the end of your talk about the need for revolution. And that sense, I mean, after saying da 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 da, or ba 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 ba, doesn't matter, that the characterization of this period is that something is over. Basically, I think postmodernism, deconstruction, the French
is over.
Is over.
Yeah.
And it's over for 15 years, 20 years already.
Yeah.
The French what? The French?
The French, I said the French, the French channel, the French thought, the French philosophy, criticism, the critical thought of the French, from Lacan to Derrida, from Lyotard to Baudrillard, from this to that, from everything that flooded the American universities and flooded the Hebrew universities, and I am for it, and I was through it, and I was teaching it, and everything, and it's all there also. But this is over. And the question that seems to me the important question at this moment about speech and representational speech is that sense that I was surprised to hear it from you, but I'm also glad to hear it from you, because there is a sense of wanting or wishing for a beginning. And in that sense, the question is, how do we recreate modernism? How we recreate something in Hebrew? It's, by the way, in Hebrew, it becomes very significant, because I quoted today, like Guy Davenport, when he once said that modernism is actually the invention of the archaic. And the question is, what today, doing the very experimental thing, the very contemporary thing, the thing that makes in different ways, doesn't matter, colloquial language, and CNN, and Bible, and I don't know, middle-aged, how do you say, the poetry of the Middle Ages in Spain, for instance, in Hebrew. Medieval, that's it, that's the word. Medieval poetry, everything together. So you take the archaic, you work with something that you are part of without even wanting to, but falling into it, into the stream of time, of history, of language, etc., etc. And it happened to me in a later book that suddenly I was flooded with biblical verses that came to me in the middle of the night, and I couldn't stop for 7 weeks to write something that is in a language which, of course, I studied in school, but I never used this language. And suddenly, it's a kind of an underground level which came up. So it's something that is archaic, But how do we play with something that is archaic in a new idiom? And this, to me, is the revolutionary spirit that is needed today.
And I think I wrote a piece recently, I don't know whether people saw it, on Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, yes. not a poet I had ever worked on, but because I reviewed a book on Poe, and I was reading about they now have built a new statue to Poe in Boston. I think one of the reasons for Americans Poe will come back, or has come back, is because the sound of poetry has been so neglected for years.
Right.
And so neglected. You get all this endless free verse that isn't really poetry at all. Right. It's not poetry. What makes it poetry? And so I started to think about memorability and how in the past we always used to think that poetry was something that has something to do with memorability. You can recite it. You remember lines from it. I can quote lines from Yeats or lines from Eliot, from Poe. But most poetry that's written today, I defy anybody to remember a single line of any, many of these things that are out there. And when that happens, you're going to get a return now, maybe via Song of A or something, but you will certainly get a return where people feel that poetry, there has to be sound involved. Right. There has to be sound structure, I should say, involved. However it's structured, I'm not saying it's going to be, there's a lot of interest in rhyme again, but I'm not saying it's going to be conventionally metrical, but it cannot keep on in the way it is in America. I'm not saying anything because I think Hebrew poetry is different and has been different all along, but the typical American poem that you read when you pick up a magazine, it's just lineated prose. It's actually better if you read it straight across and read it as prose, because it might sound, there might be some interesting content, but there is nothing about it that has any of the qualities that anybody from the Bible on down ever thought was poetry. So that has to change.
By the way, I at this moment that you mentioned Yeats, there is this little poem that he wrote. It's called 19th Century and After. And it's exactly about this. He says...
1919?
19. No.
1919, that poem?
No. No. It's 1900 and... never mind, I'll say the poem. The poem says, though the great song is heard no more, there is a keen delight in what we have. The rattle of pebbles on the shore under the receding wave.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
We'll continue